So recently, I volunteered at a casual board game event for kids that I knew. And a few of the kids in attendance had known about my involvement with D&D and really had never gotten the opportunity to give it a try. Now, to complicate it, I had a prior commitment to attend, so I had only about 25 minutes to play, but I still decided to run D&D for them for only 25 minutes, and it was awesome. They were so excited by the medium and so pumped to play. But it's not like I busted out a player's handbook or had them spend time rolling up characters. I had 25 minutes to give an introductory D&D experience to a bunch of really excited kids. So what I had to do was narrow it down to just the essentials. And really, that's what we're going to be talking about today. Hi, I'm John from Incendium D&D, and in today's episode, we're really going to discuss the essential core of what makes a strong D&D experience, as well as talk about how to navigate some of the personality archetypes that are bound to emerge at your table. So, let's get started. Alright, I know you guys have already heard the basics, but let me just spend a little bit of time setting the scene for you. At this gathering, I had about 6 or 7 kids that all wanted to try out D&D. Their ages ranged from as young as 7 to about 13. And as I was reflecting on the experience, with the car ride after, I realized that each of them actually was like this perfect one-dimensional personality archetype for a lot of play styles that I see emerge naturally at any given table. But we'll get into that later. Really, all I had was a small foam D20 and the theater of the mind. A lot of times with beginner D&D content, you see things about how to break down the character sheet, understanding each of the different classes, the game's balance, the game's mechanics. Heck, even our first few videos on this channel were revolving around that. But really, if you were to strip away everything down to D&D's core experience, in my opinion, it's really just about the interplay of imaginations. Even with just 25 minutes to play, I made sure to ask each of my players what their characters looked like and what their special powers were. Of course, some of them were so excited to share that they ended up kind of shouting over each other, which also led to one of our first major lessons about playing D&D, which is establishing boundaries. I mean, even though these were kids, so, there's a different age range that I'm playing with, a lot of times these personalities show up with adults who have very formed egos, which can actually make it more difficult to navigate. Just remember, no matter how excited you are to share, D&D is a team game, meaning that sometimes we have to be quiet and give the space for other people to share, even if we really, really want to. So after everyone got to kind of describe who their unique imaginary character was, I asked if any of the players knew each other or were like traveling together, or if they would just meet in a tavern. Of course, my 2 oldest players, the 13-year-olds, loved the idea of meeting in a tavern. Even though it's a big trope, it's still a fresh experience if you've never started a game like that, because you've never played a game like that. Now, this is not something I necessarily recommend for everyone to try, but to really get the conflict of the story rolling, what I did was I asked the youngest player, what was the major bad thing happening in town? And then she told me there was a series of house fires.
Oh, hold on, I dropped my pen.
Very intense for a 7-year-old. Now, of course, this got the other players' imaginations expanding. They all started to add their own little details, like one of them thought that they saw a bandit light a torch and fire arrows at a house. Another one swore that they saw a shadow on the ground of a dragon flying overhead. And of course, even though we want to honor everyone's ideas, a lot of these ideas ended up being really kind of conflicting. And we had to revisit our first lesson, respecting boundaries so that everybody can be heard. And honestly, once we established those boundaries, we got to our second lesson of the core of D&D, which is collaboration. We established boundaries so that everyone has a turn to speak, but once everybody is heard, then we can start to mesh some of these ideas together and start to build off of them. Then the DM can edit and distill those ideas down into a functional narrative. The DM, in this case me, honors and listens to all of the ideas being shared at the table. But in turn, I'm expecting the players to honor the fact that I'm going to include the best ideas into the story, and I'm going to leave out other ideas that can either be extraneous or confusing. And this led us to die rolling. I had one of the quieter players that hadn't really spoken up a lot roll the d20 to try to track down whatever was causing these house fires. And of course, I hadn't really decided what was causing them yet. Mostly because when you're playing with young kids, one thing you want to avoid is really gory violence. It's why in those like 90s kids cartoons, you could do whatever you wanted to like robots, but you really wouldn't see a lot of like people killing people. So the quiet kid rolls and they get a 3, which led to another awesome moment, which is lesson number 3, which is accepting failure as part of the game. And of course that player was bummed for a moment, and then another solution was offered. One of the youngest players asked if her character could speak to some of the animals or plants that were in the area. Of course, we're not playing by any real mechanics, so I said of course, and then I revealed some information about a trail that led into a cave into the mountains behind the town. I didn't dismiss the fact that the first player had failed their attempt, but also I didn't allow it to stop the adventure. Failure is part of the story, but it doesn't mean that your character is just done for, the game is over. And it led to a lot of creative thinking. Now, just one more thing to add in here. Pretty much as soon as this young player had asked for this really creative solution and then we resolved it, she said to me, I don't really want to play anymore. And that's just a thing to understand with kids, especially young kids. D&D is a game that requires a lot of disciplined focus. And it's not good to really push it because it's a game that's supposed to be a get to, not a have to. So when I play games with younger kids, unless they're like at least 12 years old or older, I let them kind of flow in and out of the game. And that way it also encourages kids that might have been a little bit shy to begin with to step in when they see that it's a more comfortable experience. It's not as scary as they thought it was. And also it gives kids that give it a try to bow out and go float and do their other kid stuff. So the party eventually follows the trail to this cave in the mountains behind the town, and they discover that the thing causing the house fires was a golem. Again, inanimate robot object, very cleanly beat up and destroyed without having to get into any moral quandaries. And as a construct, it wasn't really malicious, it was just destructive. And I didn't like roll initiative, it was more like when a kid had an idea of how to fight the golem, I would just give them the d20, have them roll. I'd get super excited at high numbers, I'd gasp at low numbers. And occasionally, after about 3 of their turns, I'd have the golem go. And most of the action was just really descriptive. It's not like I was keeping track of hit points or anything. But, when I'd say, the golem, slams into your character, they would feel it. They were into the role play, which is a really good thing to remember. A lot of times in D&D, we get caught up with the metrics, but it's the imagination that matters. The metrics, especially for a full game of D&D, really help ground the experience and make sure that all of the decisions are balanced. Saying that the golem takes 16 or 70 damage doesn't matter if we're not comparing it to anything. So of course, they defeated the golem and the game was over. 25 minutes, exactly. And if I toot my own horn a little bit, I think it was a pretty representative, introductory experience of D&D for kids without the headaches of any rules arguments. That isn't to say that I think D&D is better without rules. It's just that ignoring a lot of the rules, especially with a tight time limit and a younger audience, ended up being beneficial in this circumstance. And if I were to say play with this group on a weekly basis, or if I had more time, this is where I could start adding in some limited mechanics. Say, starting with an ability score array, and then having their powers be based off of those modifiers. And like I mentioned earlier, the reason I picked a golem as the big bad enemy for this session was because it was an inorganic construct. It was something that we didn't have any real quandary fighting. But kids can't just beat up golems forever. So probably what I'd do is I'd make whatever monster of the week I'd present some kind of human that's been transformed into something. And once the monster is defeated by whatever means the kids come up with, it would transform back into a human. So there wouldn't be a lot of like killing and gore, anything like that. So really important overall lesson. I think this is good for all Dungeon Masters to hear. Know your time frame, know your audience. If you have new players excited about fighting all sorts of fantastic monsters, don't make them sit there and listen to the dialogue between your NPCs. Don't make them sit through political intrigue and ordering what they want for lunch. Just get to the part that they want and give them a little bit of context for their mission, but let them experience the part that they're excited about. And then you can start to sprinkle in little things to let them acquire a taste for other playstyles. If you have an hour to play, maybe give them like 15 minutes of social interaction. Don't make it too complex. And they might even find that they were looking for a combat game, but they get really excited about the social interaction. And then of course you want to balance out the different personalities at the table. One of the best ways to make sure you stick to a solid time frame is by prepping a very simple structure. In this case, I had 3 acts that I moved through. First, bad thing happens. Second, find the cause. Third, fight, and then wrap everything up cleanly. I know players that really start to lose their enjoyment of the game after about 2 hours of play. I also know players, myself included, that those first 2 hours are really a warm-up, and the most enjoyment we get is the last 4 hours of a 6-hour session. Having a 10-hour story split into 5 2-hour sessions isn't really going through all 3 acts of a story. So I find, let's say you have a 10-hour story arc planned, each 2-hour story needs to have a beginning, middle, and end, but then they overlap and they kind of chain together to make your big 10-hour arc. It takes practice and experience and mistakes and time, failure, to be able to get the skill to tell short 2-hour stories that are as meaningful as 6-hour stories. I mean, just look at the Batman. That was a really long movie. And if you have the time, like let's say you've got like time for a 6-hour session. A lot of times as a player in those sessions, I feel like the DM a lot of times rushes through a lot of complex interactions that I want to take the time to delve into. So having less fighting and more time to talk and discover and explore, those are actually my favorite sessions. And don't be afraid of messing it up. I've been DMing for 5 years now. I've been working with kids for over a decade. I have made plenty of mistakes, especially when it comes to time management. All in all, really, the only difference between a good game and an amazing game are little adjustments that you make to fit your time frame and your audience. So now, for the flip side of the video. Of course, when you do any activity with a group of kids, you get certain personality archetypes that naturally emerge. This also happens with adults. It's just adults like to think that they're above a lot of these archetypes, when really it would actually benefit and be really helpful to them to have the courage to acknowledge them. So let's run through some of these personalities. Personality type number 1 was the experimenter. Now, this was the kid that I mentioned earlier that wanted to speak to plants and animals to discover who our bad guy of the session was. And like I said, immediately after doing the thing, they lost interest and left. You get this at normal D&D tables too. A significant other gets interested in what this whole D&D thing is all about. They give it a try, they have fun, but it's not something they want to become a regular part of their life. Totally cool. A lot of these players also come up with really imaginative, helpful ideas that contribute to the story at the table, but they don't really have a passion for the game. So they usually stop around a session or 2, or in my case, after 9 minutes. It's good to include a lot of these players and find ways for them to feel helpful, but also don't take it personally when they come to the realization that this is something that, they'd rather not have as a regular part of their life. Now, personality number 2 is the super excited player. This kid was so excited, they would not stop talking. Really, the only skill that this kid had was they could turn down the volume, but the talking was still nonstop. So it was like, but still, this player had some really good ideas. They imagine their character as having like these Greninja-like water shurikens. And that actually ended up being instrumental in defeating the golem in the climactic encounter. One thing to be aware of though when navigating this personality type is that a lot of times excited players get so enamored with their own ideas that they forget to find ways to connect to the other players on their team. Because again, this is a team game. So rather than douse his excitement by telling him to like shut up and listen to everyone else, I just wanted to channel it and challenge it by asking, hey, how can you link up and contribute to some other players' ideas? How can you guys work together? And eventually this culminated in the final fight where instead of getting, the one big final blow, this player actually ended up setting up another character to get like the final strike, which does naturally put me to number 3, which is the power gamer. And I know, I'm kind of one of these two. One of the things you'll notice about these personalities is that a lot of times they'll overlap. For example, a really excited player might also be a power gamer and want to tell you all about their overpowered mechanics. And of course, this was one of the only kids at the table that had started by watching a bunch of how-to D&D videos. Now, the benefit I had is they had also never actually played D&D, which made it easier for me to direct their attention to the elements of the game that I felt mattered. But also, because we weren't playing with a bunch of different rules, this was the player that could really get easily out of hand. Of course, they're a wizard, but also have a huge anime sword, and they can go invisible, and they're faster than everyone else, and they command every single element like the Avatar. This player was extremely creative, but also their ideas were predicated on the assumption that they wanted to win at D&D. They didn't want to present any weaknesses for their characters. So, to channel that creativity, I made sure that that player had certain rules to play by. Alright, you can go invisible once. Okay, you have your giant sword and you can cast spells, but you can't do both at the same time because you need a free hand to cast your spells. But if you're using your sword, both hands have to be on your sword, since as you said, it's a giant anime sword. By having limitations, the power gamer was actually able to crystallize a single idea by prioritizing what parts of their concept they preferred over others. They ended up having some pretty creative solutions. For example, yes, they were a wizard, they had magic powers, yes, they commanded the elements, but really to get the best of both worlds, what they did was channel their elemental magic into their sword. So their sword had these elemental powers, or it could shift between being a lightning sword or an ice sword. Which led me to the next player, which is the Wallflower. This player was really quiet and really didn't speak up on their own. A lot of times I found myself turning down the volume of the other players and then inviting them to speak. But when they did, well, that's how the party survived. And what was also cool was this player also thought they were making a joke character. When I asked to describe their character's appearance and abilities, they're like, obviously, I'm a frog person. And so my eyes lit up. A frog person? That's something in Dungeons and Dragons.
What?
Yeah, actually, you have this powerful frog tongue, and maybe you can grapple with it or yank an ally out of the way. And in the golem fight, that actually ended up coming in a lot of handy. This frog joke character was able to use their frog tongue to wrap around the waist of one of their allies and pull it out of the way of the golem when it tried to slam down with its fist. And I don't know if this is fate or reading into coincidence. I also find that a lot of times Wallflower players also end up really rolling well. So when they go to roll, when they go to speak, a lot of the other players get to celebrate their success, which encourages them to want to speak up more over time. Just if you invite them to speak and then they decline the invitation, make sure not to push too hard, or I find a lot of Wallflower players will start to retreat into their shell more. So last but not least, the last personality type is the rabble rouser. At the end of this adventure, the party discovered that the golem was being tended to by this local dwarf smith, and that this dwarf had discovered this golem and was trying to repair it. Because, even though it was burning down houses, it's not like it meant to, it's not like it was sentient. So this dwarf was trying to convert this golem's programming to be more helpful. I started to narrate how this dwarf had really good intentions, and then one of the players speaks up and just says, "I killed the dwarf." The rest of the kids erupted into laughter. The rabble rouser a lot of times will do things to just see if they happen. And of course, a lot of DMs have an instinct to punish those kind of players for not playing the game they want to play. And also, those DMs kind of have a point in that a rabble rouser can start to ruin the experience for everyone else. Even though the other players were laughing at this time, enough rabble rousing in an ongoing game can eventually start to undermine any sort of narrative tone that you might be going for. So in this case, it was just the end of the session, and I just wrapped it up and said, well, kids, that's Dungeons and Dragons. But for rabble rousers, a lot of the times, what I'll do is I'll point to the fact that each game has a unique tone. A lot of times, what they need is just to see the consequences of their own actions, which isn't to punish them right away, but a lot of times they might feel guilty about it later on. Or you can set up a campaign specifically for them, like say, you know, I really want to do more of a serious thing with this game, but there is a sillier game that maybe that you'd be a better fit for. And then you can give them the choice. What's more important to them, rabble rousing or RP? And if they just want to rabble rouse, build a rabble rousing game. Might not be the most exciting game to play, but you can have some fun with it. In the end too, I do find that the rabble rousing players, more often than not, develop into some of the most thoughtful and sincere players at the table. After all, there was a time I was a rabble rousing player, and that's a lot of stuff to learn in only 25 minutes of game time. So now I'm curious, what are some core personality archetypes you see emerge at your tables? How long do you prefer to play Dungeons and Dragons for? If you haven't done so already, make sure to hit like, subscribe, and ring the little notification bell. And have an awesome day, everybody. Bye-bye now.